Hello, everybody. I'm Derek Arden, and welcome to Monday Night Live, live and uncut podcast, YouTube, with some very interesting guests. Tonight, I got Justin Urquhart-Stewart, the media commentator, BBC news expert, and a thoroughly nice guy who I've worked with over many years. Before I introduce Justin formally, if you're watching this on YouTube or on my podcast channel, please could you follow me? It helps all sorts of issues, particularly bearing in mind we're not sponsored or paid for on this channel. Justin, welcome to Monday Night Live. I've got to kick off with what's going on in Iran. Can you explain that to me? And can you explain what the strategy is and what's going to happen to the financial markets?
Good. And what's the next question? I was trying to explain what's going. I thought the two things that struck me this weekend. Some was saying actually we've seen someone do a U-turn of 360 degrees, which isn't really a U-turn because after 360 degrees means you're still going the same direction as before. So that was one politician who you could write off quite quickly. And then, of course, they're saying, well, we'll be able to bomb to be able to get rid of all the dangerous substances. Well, of course, what's been happening over the past few weeks is a lot of these suspicious substances have already been moved. So I'm afraid it'll be interesting to see what happens when we finally get the details in as what's been bombed or not. But people who are sitting there saying, well, they've been sitting there doing nothing the past few weeks, I don't think that's not going to be true. So I have to say it came as a big shock because, of course, forgive me, and I must bow to the knowledge of your great audience and knowledgeable audience, particularly on America, in terms of course, that he was so keen on making sure he kept out of all wars, and if possible, could he please have a Nobel Peace Prize? That's probably just gone out the window, and obviously finds himself in a position where he has. So he's upset some of the more extreme MAGA people don't get involved. Bit, of course, I think is more important for the rest of us around the world is what does this do to the global economy? And we can all sit there and sort of look rather glumly as to what's happening. Well, the primary driver as to what happens next isn't going to be Iran, not even going to be America. It's actually going to be China. What's China going to be doing in terms they're the ones who've actually got the influence over various parties concerned. So whether it's Russia, whether it's actually going to be obviously Iran as well, and China's influence over North Korea. So it is going to be quite interesting, not just as necessarily the obvious three parties, Israel, and obviously Iran and America, and Britain, as ever, seen as the little Satan or America's poodle, dragging along behind. So where do we go to from here? Well, all we have to do is actually look at those areas as to whether your confidence is there. Is the economy going to stop? And the answer is no, it won't stop. But it depends how much of our confidence has been shaken. Because remember, that's the word we've said before, the one word that runs any economy. If you haven't got any confidence, no one's going to spend any money, or they're not going to invest. Companies aren't going to invest. And that's when governments find it much more expensive. They have to start shelling out much more money. Probably shelling's the wrong word to use in terms of armaments and other issues. But of course, actually, it's not very good for the economy to grow, apart from those areas where actually, they will find more expenditure, which will be obviously on defense and infrastructure and things like that. So we now need some sound, solid minds, which, given the fact we're doing politicians, of course, is diametrically the opposite. But my view is at the moment, I don't think we should be panicking. If you want to go and panic, the usual excuse is quite straightforward. Go and get a couple of cases of whiskey and find a cave in Wales and go and sit there and forget all about it. The rest of the time, the global economy will grow because it's in everybody's interest to do so. Who especially? China, who've got some big economic issues to try and manage. But China needs America to function, and America needs China to be able to, well, continuing to buy its debt, please. Thank you very much. We've used the phrase many times before, the symbiotic relationship between China and America. Now, who's one of the largest purchaser, or if not the largest purchaser of American debt? The answer is, well, apart from America when it's doing QE, but actually more to the point, it's the Chinese. They take it in turn with the Japanese. Also, of course, China needs America because who buys Chinese products? America. So it's going to be quite fascinating to see. And I don't know, I bored you before with this one, but I'm actually just writing the preparations for something about tariffs 2,000 years ago with the Roman Empire and what impact they actually had in the Middle East. And how you saw that the final destruction of Petra and Palmyra because Rome decided to actually build, I think we call it probably in a Suez Canal, except 2,000 years before the Suez Canal, to connect up the Red Sea with the Nile. So all the trade went to Alexandria, which was owned by privately, as you do, nice having your own private country of Egypt, owned by Augustus. And he got 25%, and that was his tariff imports. 25%. And that meant effectively that within less than 150 years, Petra was bust, and all the other areas that were impacted by the tariff changes. So it's fascinating. 2,000 years ago, those tariff changes had huge impact. And 2,000 years later, they were an Iron Age economy. We're just an aged economy. And it has very, very similar issues indeed. So now it's down to the time to say, are we going to stay with this and assume that we'll end up, as ever, muddling our way through it? Or as Churchill used to put, buggering on. And that's much more likely. Should we all be panicking getting out of it? No, but now is the time actually to make sure you're taking a the more defensive positions, building up your cash. Because if you do think we're going to get more positive eventually, and we don't blow ourselves to kingdom come, that there will be a recovery. But in the meantime, there will be times when, if you think it's positive, there are going to be some interesting investments at a summer discount. Well, maybe a late summer discount. But in my view, hold hard. We haven't been defeated yet.
So spending on arms, which is everyone's going to do, is that going to help the economies?
Oh, it does. Certain areas that do, yes. If that's a key element of your economy, or you're trying to make sure that get a part of your economy going again. The Germans, of course, who cut a huge amount of their cuts on the army. It was I've forgotten the lady. Who's the lady currently running the EU? Not van der Leyen. Anyway, she was a German defense minister for a while. When actually had to admit that the Germans had 8 working tanks. Now, I know it's good to actually cut back on a defense budget, but getting down to 8 tanks really doesn't get you very far. So confidence levels there are pretty low. No, what you're seeing is Poland's now raised its defense expenditure of 5% of its GDP. Compare that with the UK. If you smudge for figures, you probably get to about 2.5%. And everyone else desperately trying to catch up. Why? Because the great orange one has been shouting at them. Mind you, all the American presidents have said the rest of NATO should pull up their socks and damn well go out and actually pay your part and not just actually expect America to carry it through. But none of them actually had, frankly, willing to break the complacency and smash the mirror, as Trump has done, to actually say, you will actually pay up. Otherwise, we're not going to stand behind you. Now, what do you have to think about? He's actually right in that case. Why should the Americans bear the burden of it? And the rest of us sitting there saying, well, so much we can try to do here. So we've got a few tanks left. Yes, the answer, it'll have an impact in Germany. Certainly already seeing impact in Poland. But what it tends to do, of course, it then diverts money away from other elements, particularly at a time when that loss of confidence has been fed through. Ignore the equity market at the moment. Look at the bond market. The bond market will tell you, remember, it's about 10 times larger than the equity market, what confidence there is and what future cost of money is going to be, and give you an idea about people's views on inflation. And just touching on that at the moment, if you do see the Iranians reacting by cutting the Straits of Hormuz, which is actually a bit stupid for them to do, because actually most of their exports go through and imports go through the Straits of Hormuz. So we'll be actually slashing our own wrists doing so. But nonetheless, at moments like this, you're with a very, very eccentric, I think it's being polite about it, leadership. Nothing would surprise me if they would actually get the Islamic Guards out to actually cause mayhem there. Meanwhile, the government just says nothing to do with us, governor, but just enough absolutely to make sure there's enough confidence and mayhem in the global economy so that people will start actually then being easier on Iran. I don't think that's going to happen. Iran's going to be kicking like mad, and you're going to have to try and at some stage find a way of trying to manage your way through it. How that's done, I have no idea at the moment, except the fact that all routes lead back to Beijing at the moment. They're the ones who will be actually controlling where the investments are going, where the support is going, and trade. They're the ones who can put maximum effort onto controlling North Korea, and also the Russians. Remember, Russia's no longer a superpower, just a dangerous power. I don't know if I think I mentioned to you, actually, I was doing the figures on the GDP of Russia. It works out, forgive me for those not in Britain, but GDP of Britain isn't exactly that large, but it's the 6th largest economy in the world. Well, the Russian economy is round about 48% the size of the UK economy. It's tiny. Its population is decreasing, numbers falling off a cliff, some probably being pushed, I suspect. And you're not seeing that economy growing. You're seeing inflation around about 20%, say around about, because nobody produces decent figures who'd possibly believe in Russia at the moment. So yes, the route to solving this issue is actually going to be America with China having enough power to be able to manage either side to make sure no one gets completely barking over this sort of thing. So what do we do in the meantime? Well, my view is we should have already been taking a defensive position. You can make yourself in a position where you can start building up your cash, because sometime in the next 2 years, there will be some great, as I was saying, some summer sales to go and get. When everyone's most frightened, as the late Mr. Warren Buffett was saying, then is the time to actually then participate. That awful line about you can see when the tide's out who hasn't got their bathers on. Not a good picture to have in your mind, frankly.
I love that expression. Just for everybody on here, when you say the bond market, you mean the gilt market in the UK and the
treasuries. The treasuries in the States. And the treasuries in the States, they have, no, in fact, the bond market hasn't actually moved that much. And that's quite encouraging, because if you see the bond market move significantly higher, then that's merely indicating that your cost of your debt's going to be going up, for more money being diverted towards that, and a lack of confidence. So not many people are buying US debt. But you also have to ask the question at the moment, if you're not buying US debt, what are you going to be buying? Apart from people who still get very excited by buying gold. As soon as you mention anything to do with gold in investments, you've got the gold bugs come out of the woodwork and say, you don't understand that the value of gold has been the same value in terms of its inflation basis since the time of Queen Cleopatra. Well, I'm quite sure that's necessarily true, and I wasn't around when Cleopatra was. And of course, the big issue about gold, it may look shiny, quite nice to put around on a ring or bound to people's necks and things, but it doesn't give any dividend. There's no yield. It goes up and down, and that's it. So all very well saying that, have your defensive position. What I tend to find is when markets get very frightened indeed, everything goes down, and you have to get past that moment of panic. Remember, we saw that in the banking crisis. I remember then we were talking about good asset allocation, make sure you don't keep your eggs in one basket. Yes, but the trouble is everyone had lots of baskets and everyone decided to drop the baskets at the same time. So be very wary, and if you're investing for tomorrow, don't. That's called betting. If you're investing longer term, then you have to start looking through these things and have a level of confidence that despite our politicians, that it's more in their greater interest to actually keep the story going, no matter how frightening for us it may seem in the meantime.
Now, you mentioned Russia. You haven't mentioned Ukraine. You've mentioned China. You haven't mentioned the South China Sea and whether there's any warships in the South China Sea trying to defend what might happen with in that area.
I think it's much more interesting. We've had Diego Garcia, which you ask most people in Britain, they look at you rather blankly, have no idea what it is, and the Chagos Islands, where our dear Prime Minister has managed to sell these off at the most astonishing value, and having to pay the good souls of Martinique to be able to take over this thing on the basis that Martinique would be the obvious power to control it. It's not. It's nowhere near Martinique. In fact, it's nowhere near anywhere. So it's, I have to say, on our part, in terms of the British government, a load of incompetence, sort of complete utter waste of money. So I think the other area is worth actually mentioning as well. Of course, what we've had is with India and Pakistan, and their dispute about just about everything from the headwaters of the Indus, which of course tends to be in the upper Kashmir area, through to, bear in mind, they're both nuclear powers in their own right. But they've been bickering over Kashmir for donkey's years, ever since the British decided to lift up their skirts and run like mad before anyone else blames us. But you've actually got the other element. 20% of Kashmir isn't controlled by Pakistan, isn't controlled by India, it's controlled by China. And the direct translation of that actually was, and the Chinese were there to look after the country, which is very nice. Ask the Tibetans, I'm sure they appreciate the same issues there. But you mentioned the things about South China Sea. There's a whole list of issues about Chinese borders, which are areas of concern. South China Sea, remember they managed to upset, well, Brunei, that's hardly huge, Indonesia, Philippines, obviously Taiwan, Vietnam, and Malaysia. And that's all very well saying all of these countries are arguing with China, but they all look at China and go, oops, the dragon's quite large and we're not. And so kowtowing to the Chinese might inevitably happen as they start building on some of the rather dubious coral atolls in the South China Sea and claiming that as sovereign land, to which you could then add another 200 miles as economic sovereign areas, which take you halfway through the Malay Peninsula. Well, very near to it anyway. So that's going to be an issue bubbling away. Add to that, obviously, the Taiwan issue. Add to that, it's gone out of the news recently, East China Sea, the arguments between China and Japan about a set of lumped rocks in the East China Sea. And they're saying it's all to do with oil and gas. No, it's not. It's to do with something much more important in the Far East, known as face. And who's going to face each other off? And the Japanese know exactly what they're doing when the Prime Minister turns up at one of the shrines every year for the war dead. And that's well publicized. And the Chinese just take that as you're stirring up the pot again, because as far as the Chinese are still waiting for the Japanese to come out with one word, which was sorry, but they don't do that. So all of this is just adding to this turmoil. You also had the other dispute over what we used to call Assam, but northeast China, northeast India, where they're still lobbing shells at one another. So India's got some interesting border issues, but then again, so has China. And the Chinese expansion, by where that's a fashionable term to use, neo-colonialism, everyone throws around all over the place, but their idea of buying their way into other nations to actually move the traditional linkages, and classic cases of the Caribbean, where it's mostly sort of French, Dutch, and mostly British, and they're going in and proffering relatively small amounts of money to get their levels of influence in there. Funny enough, actually, in Africa, I was in Uganda with a mate of mine there who's study with, and he's quite senior in their little world. Actually, just long as no one else is listening, he's actually the king now. It's quite funny. He got his father's job back. But the point is, he said, I'm looking to have more investments into the oil industry here. Do you know anybody? I wasn't actually thinking of the local petrol station. And he said, oh, by the way, we don't mind who the investors are, but they mustn't be Chinese. And what's happened is you've had three waves of the investments. One where the Chinese turn up in apps, not just knowing Swahili, but they know the patois, they know who to speak to, and it's investment into infrastructure because they want to make sure they're securing supplies of whatever commodities, and Uganda's got a pretty good range of them. And of course, what happens then is the second wave of then Chinese come in, and they're not quite as amenable as the first lot. And then the third wave come in, and you've got Chinatown, which means no blacks. And you'll see these areas just actually creating their own cantons. And this attitude has been really a kickback to the Chinese now, whereas before they were seeing they were not the old imperial powers, and now suddenly the emperor's clothes seems to have dropped off, and they are saying, yes, you are a colonial power, and you're behaving in what looks like the same way. So the Chinese have to learn very quickly that just money and force ain't it. You've actually got to use proper politics to do so. Interesting area actually down in Sri Lanka and southern India. In southern India, obviously concern there with the Chinese Indian Ocean Navy there. And they get very fed up with the Indians on the basis that it's the Indian Ocean, not the Chinese Ocean. You have to keep your navy here. Well, they approached the Sri Lankans, who were bust at the best of times, and said, you need a port. I tell you what, you need a port in southeast Sri Lanka. I don't know if you've been to southeast Sri Lanka, it's a delightful place, but it's you and a few elephants wandering around, not much else. And there's no need for a port there at all. But they said, we'll buy the port for you, we'll build it. And by the way, some soft debt. And that's fine. So they built a port which just happens to fit the number of ships who are in the Chinese Indian Ocean Navy. Funny that. That really upset the Indians a very great deal. And by the way, as for that debt, the cost of that debt has now doubled. Why? Because they were late in payments, and the Chinese will traditionally will always actually put up the cost of it really very significantly indeed. So that port in southeast of Sri Lanka is now owned by the port of Shanghai. This is neo-colonialism. And so while short term, it looks as though that's going to be a benefit to them, longer term, it's going to come back and bite them on the painful parts.
Well, I was going to mention there's a cricket match going on at the moment in England, England versus India. I hope that's not going to cause any issues.
No, I think it was a real issue this week as to whether England are going to turn up or not. And so could we just miss out on that one, please? And also the weather was wrong. It's called summer. And once actually Britain, it wasn't raining. So the English fans are desperately hoping for a jolly good old-fashioned thunderstorm tomorrow. So instead of us being beaten soundly by a much better team, we'll just sit there and say, "Oh, sorry, chaps, well, it's a draw then, so that's okay. We won't get too embarrassed."
Apologies to our American friends who are on here that haven't quite got cricket yet, but there are a lot of Indians and Pakistani people in
But
America.
Derek, the first international cricket match was between England and one of their founding states in America. That was an international test match, and just like the Revolution, England lost.
Oh well, oh well. Before we finish, let's go to Europe, Justin, because some of those Baltic states are quite concerned. They're putting 5% GDP in, aren't they? They're quite nervous about Trump pulling out of NATO. What's that doing to their economies?
Well, not just their economies. Look at Europe at the moment. Question: who's running it? The answer is don't know. And because after Mrs. Merkel, who was a great leader, despite rather strange agreements with the Russians over gas, which she thought at the time would tie in Russia into the democratic structure of the West, failing to realize it also tie us into actually how Russia was operating, exactly the opposite. But she was a leader, whether you like it or not. At the moment, I can't see a leader anywhere in Europe, which means, therefore, you end up with the European Commission, the bureaucrats, them running it. Now, I wasn't pro-Brexit at all, but one of the things that was being warned about, and back to those Mrs. Thatcher, is do not let that commission become all-powerful, because they're not elected, and they can make those decisions irrespective of what the member nations say. Slowly but surely, you will be seeing the EU pulling apart. Not by one big revolution, but you'll see that the euro will be failing. And the euro succeeds at the moment in certain areas, so long as you're actually willing to shut your eyes and hope for the best and not look at the rules of how to run a single economy. But it will eventually fail because people will suddenly realize that you can't run an economy with a tax structure like that, trying to support that currency. It's just eventually will fail. It'll probably split into two. You'll have the new euro, and the zero, which will be Greece, or basically all the southern states. So it's going to be interesting to see where Europe goes from here, because the German economy is looking very old-fashioned. The good Mittelstand companies, which you all admired, middle-sized companies often run by families, but they were great engineering companies, which is the Germans are so good at. In terms of service companies, no, not so good at that. And so where's the future for Germany? And they're finding that much more difficult to try and answer it. Further east, you've then got countries like Slovakia, and also Romania, and also Hungary, where their attitude is much more heading towards the east rather than the EU. So again, it's not a matter of necessarily people leaving it, but what it's showing, particularly someone like Russia, that actually this big Western power that is the European Union isn't that strong, and more to the point, doesn't act in a effective manner. When it put to the test, would they all stand up to defend it? Well, given what they've been saying so far, there is no, not them all. You're quite right about the Baltic states, because obviously their history has been around for a long time, but not necessarily as individual states. Funny enough, actually, Lithuania was one of the most successful European states for over 570 years. It was the Commonwealth of Lithuania and Poland, and it was over about 570 years. And the country is really keen to get rid of this awkward state. Was Russia, the Imperial Russia, wishing to take their part, Austria-Hungary, another Russia, and of course the embryonic Reich that was the Kaiser in Germany. And so they did. Poland no longer existed. And what you're going to be seeing now with the economic states, the economies of the other smaller Baltic states, you're right, they're very frightened. You'll be hearing quite soon of Russians, Russian government, or Putin, if he's still going to be there. If you've got an available bullet, please pass it on, and be in a position where they will start saying in Lithuania, but the majority of people, of course, are Russians. They speak Russian. They're obviously right. Therefore, we must take it back. Vaguely familiar, possibly with the Czechoslovakia for the Second World War. But that's the usual arguments that's brought out then. So it's not going to be stable, is the answer. And of course, they're very frightened there because they can put 5% into their defences if they so wish. It's still pretty small. The only bit of comfort those Baltics can say is, anyone got a spare tank for the Russians to use? So when they find that their trank line tanks have disappeared, and they're now relying on some of the old T-tanks from the Second World War, life's getting a bit desperate. And Russia is bust. And we know it's bust. Well, we know full well because a lot of its assets, as a result of money laundering, have meant that money has gone elsewhere and has been frozen. How do we know that? Because actually it went to the money laundering center of the world, known as London. And if you want to get money laundering on a small scale is done. If you want to do money laundering, you do it on a really big scale. You spend a lot of money on a, say, football club, and I think to add more debt to it, so it pays it back. You can launder that money nice and clearly. Everyone thinks you're such a supporter of the arts and sports in Britain. Oh, how easy it is to con.
Justin, we're nearly out of time. Will you stay on and answer a few questions, please?
I will. I can't be too long because I have to go and sort out someone's cooking.
One last tip for anyone watching this on YouTube. You and I are very positive people. Should we continue to be positive or not?
No, I do be positive, but you're going to have to hold hard because the risks have gone up. I was reading a rather depressing set of articles about Europe in 1914 in August. And it was a lovely warm summer. Everything was fine. The economy was going okay. What's going to go wrong here? Is there going to be a war between the major nations? And there was a lot of saber rattling going on. And the answer is no. Why should they? Even after Crown Prince Ferdinand was shot, there's still a matter of, well, it's just a Crown Prince, it hasn't any impact. But of course, that was just the first fuse being lit. And you saw the knock-on effect from there. So compare with today, you'd sit there, yeah, it's completely different. And then you sit there and think, is it? So I am more concerned. So does that mean I'm not in the now rather crowded cave in Wales with my case of scotch? I should be back here and making sure to take advantage of some discounts in the desperate hope that the sane minds will be able to see our way through it. Mind you, sane minds and our politicians, not natural phrases that go together.
Justin Urquhart-Stewart, thanks for joining us. Will you come back in the autumn and let's see if your prophecies are correct?
Oh, as long as they're all still here, I'd be delighted.
Thanks so much for joining me. And thanks everybody for joining Monday Night Live.